There's a reason why the humidity in Florida feels so suffocating. It's not just the weather, it's that feeling that something is always sticking to you, something that doesn't want to let you go. My name is Alex, and I used to love the quiet of my new apartment in Tampa. But now, that same quiet is the loudest, most terrifying thing in my life. Because I'm not alone. And the worst part isn't what I see, it's what I don't see. The tiny changes. The logic that is slowly being strangled. This isn't a ghost story. Ghosts are easy to dismiss. This is something else. Something happening right now, in the very room where I'm telling you this story. And if you're listening to this in a quiet room, you might want to check behind you before we continue. It started very simply. Keys moving from their spot. A window I left cracked open that I swore I had closed. You know that feeling when you first move into a new place? Everything feels a bit off. You blame your memory, tell yourself you're just stressed. That's what I told myself for the first 3 weeks. I'm a graphic designer, so my hours are completely irregular. I often work until 4 or 5 a.m. and then sleep until noon. My apartment is on the ground floor of an old apartment complex covered in ivy. It looks charming during the day, but at night, the shadows from the old oak trees outside seem to stretch and reach for the windows like the arms of a drowning man. The first time I noticed something truly wrong was after a particularly long work session. I went into the bathroom to splash some water on my face, and my toothbrush was missing. I live alone, and I hadn't used it since that morning. After searching the entire small bathroom, I found it. It was tucked inside the medicine cabinet. There is no way I put it there, and the cabinet door was closed. My heart did a slow, heavy thud in my chest. I stood there staring at it, trying to come up with a logical scenario. Was I sleepwalking? I've never done that in my life. Suddenly, the air in the bathroom felt very thin. I grabbed the brush, washed it with scalding hot water, and tried to forget about it. But from that moment on, every tiny detail became a weapon. A couch cushion would be flipped. A book on my desk would be turned upside down. Logic always said, "Alex, you're just forgetting, you're working too hard." But the changes were becoming more personal, more intrusive. Then came the sounds. Florida buildings groan, they expand and contract because of the heat. But these sounds had a rhythm. It was the sound of someone trying too hard to be silent. A very faint dragging sound, like a piece of cloth being pulled across the hardwood floor in the hallway. I'd be sitting at my desk with my headphones on, and suddenly I'd feel the air pressure in the room change, like a door had been opened and closed behind me at lightning speed. I'd turn around and find nothing. One night, I left my phone recording audio while I went out to get food for an hour. When I came back and listened to the recording, I felt the terror crawl into my bone marrow. For 50 minutes, there was nothing but the sound of the ceiling fan. Then, at the 51st minute, I heard a sigh, deep and very clear, right next to the phone. It wasn't my sigh, and there was no one in the apartment. It was the sigh of someone who was waiting for me to leave, someone who was sitting in my office chair, breathing in the scent of my room. I started noticing that things weren't just moving, they were disappearing. Socks, snacks from the fridge, even some old photos from my albums. There was no forced entry, no footprints. It was as if the apartment itself had started to slowly swallow my life. Ghosts don't eat your food, and ghosts don't sigh next to your phone. There was one terrifying logic that my mind refused to accept. Someone was living in the spaces I couldn't see, someone who had mastered the art of disappearing into the dead zones of my vision. Paranoia is a prison you build for yourself, but in my case, the prison was real and had physical walls. After hearing that sigh on the recording, I couldn't sleep anymore. I would sit in my bed with my back against the wall, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The humidity in Florida makes everything feel sticky, but that night, I felt a strange chill running through the apartment. I started noticing details I had never paid attention to before. The complex is very old, and the walls here are double-layered for heat insulation, leaving a narrow void between the units. I started wondering, could someone actually be living in there? The next afternoon, I decided to look for answers. I started checking the vents. They were covered in a thick layer of dust, except for one in the kitchen ceiling. The screws holding it in place were shiny, as if they had been removed and replaced recently. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and pointed my phone's flashlight inside. I didn't see anyone, but I smelled that scent again, the smell of old sweat, and something like the smell of rotting food. My heart started pounding violently. I got down from the chair trembling. I decided to try a simple trick I learned from internet stories. I placed a very thin hair on the closet door and a small cracker on the edge of the vent. Then, I pretended to leave the apartment, but in reality, I hid inside the small pantry in the kitchen, leaving the door cracked open by only a few millimeters. An hour passed, then two. The silence was so heavy I could hear the ticking of my wristwatch like a hammer. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't supernatural, it was the sound of metal hinges moving very slowly. From where I stood, I saw something that made my limbs freeze. The vent in the ceiling began to slide down in a terrifying silence. Then a hand appeared. It wasn't a ghost's hand, it was a real human hand, but the nails were long and filthy, and the skin was so pale the blue veins showed clearly. A very thin body began to emerge from the opening with non-human flexibility, as if it were accustomed to folding itself into tight spaces. It was a man, or the remains of a man, wearing tattered clothes that were originally mine, my shirt that had been missing for 2 weeks. He dropped to the floor without making a sound, like a cat. He began to roam my apartment with total sense of ownership. He went to the fridge, opened it, and started drinking directly from the milk carton while looking around cautiously. Then he did something that made my stomach turn. He went to the couch, sat down, and began to sniff the pillows deeply. Then he started flipping through my personal photo album, smiling a wide grin that revealed decaying yellow teeth. He was living my life in my absence. He wasn't a ghost haunting the apartment, he was a Frogger living in my ceiling for months, watching the tiniest details of my life, knowing when I sleep and when I wake up, using my personal belongings as if they were his own. At that exact moment, my phone rang inside the pantry with an email notification. The man froze in place and slowly turned toward the kitchen, his bloodshot eyes staring directly at the small crack in the pantry door where I was hiding.
In that moment, time stopped. The intruder's eyes were bulging, focused on the pantry door where I was hiding. The silence of the apartment in Tampa was more terrifying than any storm that had ever passed through Florida. He didn't run, and he didn't scream. Instead, he began to move toward me slowly, with strange, hunched steps, as if mimicking the movements of a spider. He tilted his head from side to side, as if trying to process the presence of another person in his kingdom. When he got within 3 feet of the closet, I smelled him clearly. It was the smell of death, the smell of someone who hadn't touched water in months, mixed with the scent of dampness and mold. He pushed the door with his pale hand very slowly. And when our eyes met, I didn't see anger in his eyes, I saw a terrifying void. He whispered in a raspy, dry voice, as if his vocal cords had withered from lack of use, "You ruined the game, we could have stayed together much longer." Adrenaline exploded through my body. I pushed the closet door with all my strength, slamming it into his face, and ran toward the kitchen looking for any weapon. I grabbed a long bread knife and turned around to find he had regained his balance with incredible speed. He didn't attack me with a knife or a weapon, instead, he was holding my own screwdriver that he had stolen from my toolbox weeks ago. He began to chuckle, a sound like rubbing cardboard together, as he said, "I know where you sleep. I know how you breathe when you dream. I am part of your walls now." I lunged for the apartment door, but he was faster. He threw his thin body in front of the door and began slamming his head against the wood violently, repeating, "My house, my house, my house." Blood was streaming from his forehead, but he didn't seem to feel the pain. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just facing a thief. I was facing someone who had completely lost his mind within the cramped spaces of my apartment. I gathered my courage and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Fire!" I lit a kitchen towel from the stove and threw it toward him. He recoiled with an instinctive fear of the fire, giving me a single second to turn the lock and escape into the dark hallway. I didn't stop running until I reached the police station. When they came back with me, the apartment was as quiet as it had always been. The vent was closed, and there was no sign of the man. The officer initially thought I was hallucinating from overworking, but when they climbed into the crawlspace behind the walls, they found the nest. There was a narrow void directly above my bedroom, furnished with my missing clothes. The walls were covered with photos of me that he had taken with my old phone, the one I thought I had lost. Most terrifying of all, they found tiny holes drilled into the ceiling directly above my bed. He had been watching me every night from a distance of no more than 12 inches. They also found food scraps and a notebook where he had written the most intimate details of my life, when I bathe, when I eat, even the nightmares I talked about in my sleep. They didn't catch him that night. He escaped through the building's central AC vents. I moved out of Florida the very next day, and I no longer touch work related to design or stay in front of screens for long periods. I now live in a small farmhouse in the middle of the country, with solid brick walls and no dropped ceilings or wide vents. But even now, when it gets quiet at night, I find myself staring at the ceiling. And when I hear the sound of wood expanding from the heat, my heart stops for a second. Because I know now that ghosts aren't what we should be afraid of. Instead, we should fear that person who might be sitting right now in the dark void above your head, waiting patiently until you close your eyes.